Well, hello and good afternoon, everybody joining us virtually from wherever you are this afternoon. Thanks for joining us for today's presentation in our ongoing 2021 CCOVI Lecture Series. My name's Sarah Ackles. I'll be moderating this lecture for you this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Marketing and Communications Officer at Brock School of Climate Enology and Viticulture Institute, otherwise known as CCOVI. Our lecture is going to run about 45 minutes today for our speaker, and then we'll have a question and answer period following that, as we've been doing so far in the series. That said, please feel free to type your questions into the chat feature at any time during this lecture. I'll collect them all at the end and then ask them of our speaker when she's all finished. So with that said, I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker who's joining us today. It's our very own Dr. Belinda Kemp. Belinda gained her PhD at Lincoln University in Canterbury, New Zealand. And while she was there, she studied tannin, volatile aroma compounds, and sensory characteristics of Pinot Noir wine. She's currently the Senior Staff Scientist in Enology here with us at CCOVI, as well as an adjunct professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Brock University. Previous to her work as a wine scientist, Dr. Kemp also gained practical still and sparkling winemaking experience in commercial wineries in New Zealand and the United Kingdom. She also organizes the annual Fizz Club, which many of you might know about. It's very popular with our Canadian winemakers, both in Ontario and out west in British Columbia. And she also serves on the VQAO Standards Development Committee. Her current research is focused on the Maillard reaction in sparkling wines, wine flavor chemistry, the impact of sugar on wine aroma and flavor, leaf removal strategies according to grape variety and wine style, the influence of sour rot on sparkling and still wine flavors, and phenolic management of sparkling and red wines. Today, Belinda is going to talk about something a little bit different for her, and she's going to be discussing her recent research that will delve into why consumers buy Ontario wine. So with that, Belinda, I'll ask you to please share your slides and you can go ahead and present.
Hi everybody, not sure everybody's logged in yet, but I'm going to kick off anyway. So today's webinar is all about why do Ontario wine consumers buy local wine. It's also about a couple of other things which we'll see. This study was done by myself, Hannah Sharnock, who's a master's student with Gary and myself, and Gary Pickering as well. Now, today I'm going to talk a little bit about the background to the study, so why did we do it, the aims and objectives, the methodology, what we actually did, survey questions, and give you some information on the demographic data. We're going to cover the local food questions and the responses, the frequency and reasons for purchasing Ontario wine, the consumer perception of what buying local wine and food actually is, what it means, and something called the new ecological paradigm scale, which basically is something that measures the environmental values of people, of respondents, and then summarize some key points for you. So, background to the study first. Well, this is a small part of a much bigger study funded by OGWRI, the Ontario Grape and Wine Research Incorporated. It was led by Dr. Gary Pickering, but also myself. Well, I was involved, and also a couple of other people, but also Hannah Pickering. Hannah Pickering helped with the Qualtics data, so I just wanted to acknowledge her first. And secondly, Hannah Sharnock helped with the statistical analysis. Well, actually, she did quite a bit of it, to be honest. So the four of us worked on this. So the previous studies have always been concerned about food and local food and what it means. And they've found that there's a great diversity in the meaning or understanding of the word local. This actually also came about during the COVID-19, where people are only allowed to exercise locally. And of course, people's idea of exercising locally is quite different from one another, I think. But also the perception of local by Ontario food shoppers has also already been studied in 2008. And although local food was widely valued, it's also was found to be highly interpretive in its meaning. So people interpreted the word local in very different ways. The definition for local wine is in Ontario is extremely vague and subjective. You see in social media, you see in PR, everything about drink local wine, drink Canadian wine, drink local wine, drink Ontario, drink Niagara, all these sort of things. So what do we mean as when we say, or wineries say, and associations say local? And then the point of this study was to actually find out what consumers think of is local wine themselves. So there have also been quite a few reasons for people purchasing local food. We don't know about why people purchase local wine in the same way, but these have been identified as things like environmental concerns. So there's your carbon footprint and things like that. Food product recalls and scares. I'd like to think we don't have too many of those in the wine industry. And of course, concern for the local environment. People often think that by buying local, they're putting money into the local economy. So a little bit more information. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency, CFIA, is actually responsible for all food labelling in Canada. And on their website, they interpret local to be food produced in the province or territory in which it is sold. I think that makes sense with regards to food. That's quite easy. And this second definition becomes slightly more confusing, I think. Food sold across provincial borders within 15 kilometres of the originating province or territory. So there's two definitions that they have on their website. Now, local is completely voluntary on all foodstuffs, on the labels of all foodstuffs, I should say. And the food industry is encouraged by CFIA to add qualifiers. So on food, for instance, would be the name of a city. And in that sense, you could probably say the VQA Ontario appellation or sub-appellation could be considered a qualifier because we're saying where the wine, the grapes or the wine comes from, originates from, I should say, or in some ways it could be referred to as local. So what does local mean to Ontario consumers in terms of food and wine? And as I mentioned earlier, we see many sort of different messages in PR and marketing with regards to whether it's local is those to Niagara region for those living in Niagara, or the same for Prince Edward County or Lake Erie North Shore. It could be Ontario wine, it could be Canadian wine. It could be the couple of provinces over, it could be, it's all sorts of things. So what do consumers really think is local? And why is it important to define what wineries actually mean when they say local? Well, as I said, it's the use of language, being consistent and concise. It allows you a targeted approach for sales, so specifically for things like Niagara only or food outlets or age groups. And do Ontario consumers think local wine means Ontario wine or wine that's come from Ontario? So let's have a look. We've got some interesting results for you today. Now, a couple of weeks ago, just before we start, Wine Intelligence presented a fascinating webinar with regards to their research on Canadian wine consumers across Canada. I think their number was much bigger than ours, well, double ours. It was about 1,000 people. So I borrowed this information and data from them, but they found that there's certainly during COVID-19, there's been a great trend towards localism and buying local. And basically that Canadian wine sold in Canada had increased by 24%. Now they referred to in their presentation as country of origin change. Sorry, excuse my pronunciation, with regards to purchase. But country of origin is not the same as local. Well, not if you're a country the size of Canada or possibly maybe in a country that's smaller. But then you've all got different wine regions within that country. So domestic wine has been a big winner during COVID, although that might not actually feel like that when you're the winery or the winemaker or the marketing people at the winery itself at the moment. But there's been a strong bias towards Ontario sales with 47%. I just have to get this right because it's not my data, but 47% of the increase of the sales has come from Ontario wines, possibly because there's more online spending and wine purchasing and things online. So this has been over the last year, I believe. But comes back to the same point. Local is not the same as the country of origin. I'm sure if you went to Spain, the country of origin is going to be Spain, but there's many regions within that. And would Spanish drinkers feel the same way with regards to the word local wine, to say it comes from anywhere in Spain? I suspect not as well, but I'm just giving that as an example. Obviously, we haven't checked on Spain. So the main aims of this study were to define what the term local means to Ontario consumers, firstly in terms of food, and then in terms of wine, and how those two compare. Then we wanted to evaluate whether demographic factors and environmental values influence local wine purchasing. And just as a sideline, there's been many studies on the idea of this local food and certainly the definition. For instance, Texan consumers, 64%, defined local as coming from 100 miles from home, 25% 200, 8% said 400 miles. Now, I don't know whether you remember, but back in 2007, for those of us that were old enough then, I guess, there was a BC couple who sort of pursued this idea of 100 miles radius, and they actually ate food, local food in BC that only came from 100 miles from radius from their home. I'm afraid I don't know their name, so I can't flog their book, but it's still, the book's still in print, I believe. And the idea with local food is people do assume, certainly in literature, that local food is food that comes from within 100 miles of your residence, your home, if you like. Is that the same for wine? We don't know. We've never looked at it before. So, as I said, the use of the term local wine can be confusing. And do consumers perceive local wine in the same way and use the terminology in the same way that wineries and marketeers do? So let's have a look. So what did we actually do? Well, first of all, we got permission from Brock University Research Ethics Board, and we developed the questionnaire. As I mentioned, we got help from Hannah Pickering, putting that into the Qualtrics software. We targeted only wine consumers in Ontario. Now, the questionnaire was completed in April 2020, so we went into lockdown, I think it was around the 15th of March, so about 6 weeks into lockdown. So how much that would affect our results, we don't know at the moment. It's not like we didn't think at that time it was going to last a year, I suspect, or longer. We actually initially had 950 respondents, but we had quite a lot of those were incomplete surveys where people just went in, started and give up straight away, or they just took less than 120 seconds, went bush, and so they gave us, the likelihood of unreliable responses was quite high. So altogether we had 521 respondents who provided us with data that was suitable or usable for statistical analysis. So for statistical analysis, we did means, frequencies and percentages. We also grouped the frequency of wine purchasing into high and low groups. So high was weekly and monthly, and low was 3 months to 1 year, or that sort of stuff. We also did chi-squared and Fisher exact tests to look at the frequency of buying local wine. We used that as our dependent variable, and we looked at that with regards to socio-demographic data, attitudes, behaviour, and the perception of buying local food and wine products. And we also did use the new ecological paradigm scale, so environmental values were assessed using that method. And these are some of our questions. So first of all, our food questions. So when purchasing meat, fruit or vegetables, I do not care where they are grown. So we had a scale there. Then we asked, in our household, we buy Ontario grown and produced food produce. Again, we've got a scale, daily, weekly, monthly, etc. Then we asked, why do you produce Ontario food products? Sorry, why do you purchase, not why do you produce? And that was a check all that apply, so they could tick as many as they wanted of those. And then we looked at how often do you look at the origin of your food, so where it actually comes from. And that was a scale of always, frequently, regularly, sometimes, seldom, never. Then we looked at the wine questions, and how often do you buy Ontario wines was the first one. The second was, when buying wines from Ontario, which region do you buy from the most? Then we asked, what does buying local meat, local food I should say, mean to you? So here we started trying to put in a distance to see if we could capture what local food means to them in terms of distance from home. And we asked the same question for wine as well. And then we asked, why do you purchase Ontario wine, which is the same question as we asked for the food. So we've got similar answers there. We've added in one or two. And then we also looked at environmental factors, values, sorry. So we have some questions here, like humans have not questions, sorry, there's statements that the respondents marked on a scale. So there's 5 of them there, so we'll have a look at those again in a moment. So those 5 questions, depending on how they mark them on the scale, come under certain dimensions. So let's take the bottom one, for instance, which is the easiest one. If people mark humans are severely abusing the environment, that comes under a scale of the possibility of an eco-crisis. So it's about scaling and grouping. So we'll come up against this in a moment. So first of all, our demographic data, well, we did brilliantly because 50.9% of people identified as female and 49.1% identified as male, so pretty balanced. When we come to age, 37.8%, the majority were in the 56 and above age group. But if you look at the other age groups, it's pretty evenly balanced out, 24% and 18% within the 36 to 45 age group. When it comes to household income, we're really sitting around, the majority are coming in at 101 to 140,000 per annum. But again, you'll see that there's a nice spread within the other groups, which are fairly balanced, with the lowest being 14% in the 46 to 65,000 per annum income. So local food questions and responses. Number 1, when purchasing meat, fruit or vegetables, I do not care where they come from. Well, actually 26.5% of people actually agreed with that statement, which is a bit of a surprise. But 61.5% of our respondents in Ontario do not agree with that, so they do care. When we asked, in our household, we buy Ontario grown and produced food products, we wanted to find out the frequency, then we had 65.4 people buying Ontario produce, food produces weekly. And then the others, for the purpose of this graph, we've sort of grouped together to say, which equates to 34.6% of people. Now here we're asking, how often do you look at the origin of food and meat? So we asked, when deciding what to buy, how often do you actually look at the labels? Well, we have 52% said frequently or regularly, 24.4% said they always check, they always look at where the foods come from. So if we joined those together, we'd have 76.4% of people saying they always or frequently or regularly look up and check the origin of the food they're buying. So that's really positive. I wonder if we have that same response with the wine. Do they go straight to the Ontario wine? So then we asked, why do you purchase Ontario food products? And this is where it starts getting even more interesting, because here we find that the main reason, but again only at 19.2%, is to support local producers. which is really positive. The next one is to help build the local economy at 16%. Then we have help maintain local farmland. So those three reasons are all what we could class as not environmental reasons, but all to do with supporting the local economy, really. Then as we go further down, we've got taste and flavour of 14.5%. 12.9% of respondents said that local food is good value for money, so Ontario food. And then down below, of less importance, is to reduce the environmental impact and to reduce the carbon footprint of food. So it doesn't mean they're not important at all. It just means it's far less important than supporting local. So will wine be the same sort of results? We'll have a look in a moment. But if we add those up, those percentages, then non-environmental reasons for purchasing Ontario food products equates to 75.4% of respondents, with only 24.6% of people saying environmental reasons for them purchasing local food. So now we get on to the wine part. Frequency of Ontario wine buying. So how often do you buy Ontario wines? Well, we found that the largest portion, 49% of respondents said they buy their wines monthly, Ontario wine on a monthly basis. However, 32% said every 3 to 6 months. Now, that might change. It might be that somebody who buys their wine, of course, every 3 to 6 months buys heaps of it and spreads out their consumption over that time before they go and stock up again. But that could equally be said for monthly. On a weekly basis, which I'm sure some of us could be classed in that group, are 13% of people who buy Ontario wines weekly. So we could improve on some of that, but also still very positive because only 2% say they never buy it out of all our respondents. So that was interesting. Now, the age group that was most likely to be high frequency purchases of Ontario wine was found to be the 18 to 35 year age group of all our respondents. Okay, so now we class those groupings, those percentages, into categories. So weekly and monthly, we said that those people who buy Ontario wines weekly or monthly were considered high frequency purchases. Those who bought it every 3 to 6 months or year, then they were considered low purchasers, or low frequency purchasers, I should say. So what we found was that those who were high frequency purchasers of Ontario wines care about where their meat, fruit and vegetables come from, and they select food as well, local foods, on a weekly to daily to weekly basis. The people who are low frequency Ontario wine consumers don't even seek out information about where their food origins from. So there's a little bit of a pattern emerging there as well. So we asked when buying wines from Ontario, which region do you buy from the most often? And 85% of our respondents said Niagara region. Now, one of the reasons for that is, of course, that Niagara region is the largest region with regards to vines and not just wineries, but also land under vine. Prince Edward County came in next at 8.1, Lake Erie North Shore 3.5, and for some reason, when we asked Ontario people when buying Ontario wines, which region do they buy from, for some reason they chose to say anywhere elsewhere in Canada, which I'm not quite sure. I think we can sort of probably ignore that slightly because they didn't quite answer the question, but still telling important information there. Now we ask the same question of the wine. Why do you purchase Ontario wine? And this is what's really, really good. We found that 35.8% of our respondents buy local wine to support local vineyards and wineries, which is wonderful news. 23.6% said taste and flavour were the reasons, and 18.5% good value for money. So those two, second and third one, taste, flavour and value for money, really bodes well for the Ontario wine industry. How fabulous is that? Then we come down to 10.2% of respondents said build the local economy. So the support for local follows on from the support for local food. The support for local wine is the same. We're seeing a tendency towards that, and that reduced carbon footprint of wine and minimal environmental impact don't really have an awful lot of, well, I was going to say importance is probably the best way to describe it. Certainly not as important as supporting local vineyards, although it might still be important. 1.6 said, I never buy local wine. I think we can live with that for a minute. And 0.4% said, I'm a member of an Ontario wine club. So certainly room there to grow and work on that, on the Ontario Wine Club membership, should you be a winery that chooses to do so. So I think that's a really positive reasons that have come out of the research there, really strong. Now, we also asked, what is a sub-appellation? Okay, for several reasons. One, because as we saw at the beginning, it's a qualifier with regards to local. So 35.5% of people said it's a specific wine area. Well, hey, allow for some people who guessed, but that's still good. But on the other side, 34.9% of people just said, I don't know. And then other people, again, respondents stated a type of wine from a specific region, quite close. So I can understand why that's 19.7%. 6.4% said a group of wineries, and 3.5% said it was a company that sells wine. So still some work to do on that, but I think we knew that as an Ontario wine industry. I think we were aware of that. So I don't think that all of that's too surprising. But now we're trying to find out what local wine and food means. And what we see here, if you look at the pale, very pale blue colour, I don't think you can see me pointing to the screen, but very pale blue colour, you'll see that the majority of respondents within Ontario who are wine consumers believe that local wine means that it comes, or perceive it as coming from anywhere in North America and Canada, and a whopping 57.6% of respondents thought that to be the case. Lower down, we've got 17.1% felt that local wine came from their nearest sub-appellation. They considered that as local. Then we have 31% felt it was 100 kilometers radius from their home. And that's quite interesting because most of the previous studies have shown 100 miles. So maybe it's the 100 that's the defining factor more than the actual units. Then we've also got within 50 kilometers, 11.6, and then down at the bottom we've got 20. Now, if we added 20, 50 and 100 together, then that would be more with regards to local and take over, be a much bigger number. But the purpose of this was to actually define it in terms of distance, whether that be 20, 50 or 100, which is bigger, not to put them all together, although in some cases I can see why we could. When it comes to buying local food, though, it's slightly different, because with regards to local food, people, and this is where it starts unraveling slightly, 34.4% said that local food was within their nearest sub-appellation. Now, it could mean that those people know about wine and know about the sub-appellations, and there could be some guesses in there, or there could be people who just ticked it. But equally it could be positive, but it's strange that it's higher than the food. The other thing is that when we came to food, this 31% is this 100 kilometer thing again, and most people after sub-appellation, the majority of people felt the local food came from 100 kilometer radius from their home, which is similar to other studies as I just mentioned. So really interesting, and also give us lots to act on because local wine consumers, let's just say this again, consumers, Ontario wine consumers, the majority feel that local wine comes from anywhere in North America and Canada, which is huge, and not in my eyes local, but maybe to North Americans who are used to driving and traveling that much out of COVID. I don't know, but I think there's some work to do here with regards to consistency and concise messaging that we need to work on. So ecological values, which we asked about, we took those questions and the scores, and we looked at how important ecological values were with regards to the answers to our questions. And importantly, but also interestingly, the only thing was that when purchasing meat, fruit or vegetables, they do not care where it came from. Well, actually, the people who disagreed with that statement, that's what became, statistically significant, that correlated more with their ecological, their environmental values, which was interesting. But nothing else. And this is what was important with regards to distance of buying wine, purchasing Ontario, and what local wine and food means. Nothing. None of that was had any correlation to their environmental values at all. So it's the support local message that and feelings that are stronger than the environmental ones. This is not my graph. This is again taken from the Wine Intelligence presentation, but I just wanted to draw your attention to this when we're looking at age groups, bearing in mind ours were the over 56 was our slightly larger age group. And what we have here is we can see two groups on the right that have been increasing in wine purchases over COVID. So again, this is thank you to Wine Intelligence. And we'll see that the boomers and the seniors have increased there by 9.8%. Now that's people of 55 and over, and that's its sort of the majority, again, where our data is came in with the majority being over 56. For some reason, we had a 1 year out. And then the other one, of course, is, I'm just trying to see which color it is now, Gen X. So Gen X is 40 to 54, so the older age group. Now, the other thing to remember with these sort of things, though, I find, is that not everybody in those age groups, those older age groups, are involved in social media and social media campaigns. So even though that they might be drinking more wine, maybe they're getting their information from online or from the less so than social media, but maybe from a website or from the food, the shop that they're going to buy, or the website they buy online from, or whatever the case may be. So not all of these people, not all Ontario wine buyers are going to be social media or savvy or on social media. So we did have limitations to our study. What people intend to do and what they actually do are two different things. What they say they do and what they actually do. So there's a level of uncertainty in there. We didn't have the information with regards to the level of wine involvement of wine consumers. So we do know that they're wine consumers, and but that's as far as we know. We don't know how many are experts, unfortunately. If we had had a higher number of environmental options in some of our responses, then we might have been able to garner some more information and in-depth information with regards to reasons for buying Ontario wine. But that wasn't the main aim. We were after local and reasons for buying local wines. So we haven't as well, and not many people have, and it's really difficult to find this out. We haven't identified in our study what environmentally friendly means in terms of wine to consumers. What do consumers think is environmentally friendly wine? I mean, I'm sure they don't take into account glass weight and all that sort of stuff. So that's something to think about in the future that we really need to get to grips with as to what environmentally friendly means, because that's going to have an impact on things like sustainability, what sustainability means. And we haven't identified their place of residence. So local could be, in our study, somebody in the north of Ontario, the south, the east or the west, we don't know. But that's the whole point of doing it, I guess. And just to summarise, so local wine, Ontario wine consumers perceive local wine as wine that comes from anywhere in Canada and North America. So the next one is, and this is really, really heartening, I think everybody should be quite excited about this, is the main reason for buying Ontario wines is to support local vineyards and wineries, build the local economy, and for taste and flavour. How fabulous. So all really good reasons and very positive reasons for buying Ontario wine. And how can you use this information? Well, I think this idea of local being Canada and North America to wine consumers needs some work. So consistent, maybe not tell people they're wrong, but maybe work with them to explain what you mean by what, when you're doing your social media or your marketing, what do you mean as a winery or as a society or as an association? What do you mean by local, and be more specific and concise? We didn't actually ask the question either, actually, as to, do you think Ontario wine is local? That was not part of it, and that we were trying to acknowledge and find out what the distance aspect of it, like we do with food. So consistency in PR and social marketing, social media, and with regards to everybody that's involved in it. Strategy specifically aimed at age groups or marketing strategies, but I think there's quite a lot of that started and happening underway already, but maybe more specific. And although it's difficult in COVID, develop campaigns that focus on local wine and food, which again, I think there's quite a lot of that, but we can always get, once COVID's out of the way, we can improve on some of that. Now, I'm not a marketer, so you might be able to use this information in all sorts of different ways if you're the marketing person at your winery or your society, your association, but it's certainly information that can be used in the future. So just as like to acknowledge Ontario Grape and Wine Research Incorporated for the funding for the Focus on Fizz project that this is part of. I'd like to thank Gary Pickering and Hannah Sharnock for doing the statistics and working with me on all of this. And Hannah Pickering as well for her help with Qualtrics software by inputting all the information. I've got any questions, I guess now, and I do have some references that I've used. So, but I'm happy to take questions.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for that, Belinda. That was great. We've got a couple questions in the queue, but we also have a couple comments from some of the attendees, which maybe I'll address first, and then I'll get into the questions. So actually, a few people in the chat today had read that book or heard of it that you referenced and knew the title. So just for your reference, it's called The 100-Mile Diet. It's written by either Alyssa or Eliza, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, Smith, and J.B. McKinnon.
That was very nice. Are they expecting me to go and buy it now, or are they going to send me their copy?
Making you do give them their cliff notes of referencing it, right? And then there was another comment as well, just I think a suggestion or maybe a query. So I know that when you talked about where people are buying their wine from, and there was the option of elsewhere in Canada, someone in the chat had suggested, what about elsewhere in Ontario? And is that something that you considered? Mostly because that would incorporate maybe developing wine regions, and this person specifically mentioned, say, the Ottawa Valley, for example. I
don't think that would help, because this was only Ontario consumers. This was only this. If it was across Canada, that would make sense as a question. But this is for me. Gary might have a different perspective on it. But asking somebody elsewhere in Ontario, if you already got things like sub-appellation and regions, or do you know what I mean? Then I'm not sure that would have helped. And again, you're giving them, you're feeding into them the answer then. Do you see what I mean? That's a leading question. And that's the other thing with regards to market research is, and this sort of work, this sort of qualitative work, is that you're yeah, it's kind of a leading question to tell them what you're after. So.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. And there was a question here, which is a good point, and I think this probably is the case, and you guys might have thought of this as well, but does 100 kilometers span the distance from Niagara to Toronto? And could that potentially explain that 100-kilometer?
I don't know why anybody's ever asking me anything about car distances. That's my first thing. I'm the worst person with regards to driving distances. I don't know. Sarah, do you know what's the distance between Niagara and Toronto?
I want to say it would probably be roughly 100 kilometers. I don't know exactly how much, but I mean, it takes about an hour and a bit to get there, right? And if you figure about 100 kilometers an hour as a speed limit, like that probably would be logical.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true in some ways. I think that's a good point, is that Niagara region being, really close to the city, but we don't know where these consumers come from. We know that they don't all come from Toronto, in which case that would be slightly different. So I think if we found out where they came from, then we could explore that aspect a bit closer. But as I said, our respondents come from all over Ontario. So the 100-kilometer thing, I think it's the 100 number. I don't know, but the 100 miles, 100 kilometers seems to be a nice round number. But I haven't got an awful lot that I can contribute to that at the moment, unfortunately.
Okay, fair enough. Interesting things to ponder for the future, I guess, right?
Absolutely. And all very useful information to have from our point of view, yeah.
Okay, and you kind of briefly just mentioned this now about them coming from all over Ontario, the respondents. Somebody asked whether there was any data on where they were from, the respondents. Did you track exactly where in Ontario, or is that anonymous and it was just age and gender?
No, I think I did say that in the presentation, that they could come from anywhere in Ontario. There is a way we can find out a general location, like as to the nearest town, but we didn't feel there was a need to. But if that is something that people want us to do, then we could consider going back to the data and finding that information out.
Okay, yeah. So I'll leave it to the person who asked the question to reach out if that's data that they're looking for in the future.
Yeah.
And there was also a question about, here's one here now. Do you think the shift to more sparkling has played any impact in this?
Oh, I should know this. Interesting. I would like to think so, but I don't know the answer to that. I think I'm not sure you could say shift, because there's an awful lot of wineries making more wines, not just more sparkling wines. So I think that's quite difficult. I'd like to, obviously, my line of work, I'd like to say yes, but because it's sparkling, but I'm not entirely sure. And that, again, would require more delving, because one of the things we didn't do was to break this down by wine style. There's a whole bunch, loads more information with regards to marketing and Ontario wine consumers that is needed, and wine style being one of them. And that may go some way to answer that question, if that work was carried out with regards to specific wine styles.
Okay. And then you mentioned one of the responses from the respondents was about good value for the money. By Ontario, and there was a question about how much price overall played into this. Is that kind of the only price element you examined, or did you drill down into that any further?
No, that's a really good point. Okay, there's two things about that. One, we did not go into price and how much people were willing to spend. No, we didn't do willingness to pay. That's one thing. And we didn't separate out VQA wines from anything else, non-VQA wines. So Ontario wines, for the purpose of this exploratory survey, was put all together. Do you know what I mean? So we didn't separate out either. So there's lots more directions this research can go down. and more information we can gather, but yeah, and price being one of them. So no, we didn't, but we can do in the future when we do something like this.
And, you know, from your perspective, you mentioned in your presentation that it was obviously very heartening to see that people wanted to support our local industry. So what do you think is kind of the most exciting part of this research to come out of this?
I think people, I think the idea that local wine is so confusing and doesn't mean to wine consumers can be anywhere in Canada. I think that's massive, and the confusion, if you just look on social media, the confusion around that, I think that probably doesn't help matters. However, it bodes well for Canada. You know, the Wine Intelligence report saying about how Canadian wine sales increased, but that level of understanding is a bit confusing. I'm really interested with regards to people thinking that supporting the local industry, supporting farmers, supporting that aspect is so strong, because I was really thinking that with such an agricultural province, that people would be more likely to go for environmental aspects, you know, because we hear about the greening and the environmental aspects and climate change so much here in Ontario. And I was quite surprised that that was so low and such little importance was given to that and those aspects compared to local economy. But maybe they go hand in hand to a certain extent. Yeah, but I thought it was fascinating, and I thought it was really, you know, the taste and flavour and the value for money and the supporting local. I think, you know, that those results bode really well for the Ontario wine industry.
Okay, and kind of looking forward, are there any plans to sort of reevaluate this post-pandemic as we kind of go back to our more normal shopping habits? Like, how much of an impact did this period of time and that shift have towards this data, do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? This was completed last April, and we're a year later. And it would be, you know, I'm sure that the wine marketing boards and the associations and the wineries are gathering some of that information for themselves so that they can present that. So we can find out what's going on there. The LCBO will obviously have their own figures. And we hadn't got any plans for it to go further, and you know, after COVID with it. That doesn't mean to say we won't. You know, we might choose to explore some aspects of this in more detail. Certainly things like the willingness to pay and the VQA wines and that sort of thing. But yeah, no plans at the moment, but never say never.
Okay, and maybe I'll ask, just, I see that it looks like that's all the questions probably, and I'll just ask maybe one final question, kind of a view, like this is a lot of market research, obviously, right? And as you kind of mentioned, applies very heavily to the marketing sort of side of the wine operation. But as you obviously are a wine scientist and winemaking is kind of more of your focus, do you have any input about how that could be used from the winemaking perspective, knowing this information, like your thoughts on that?
Oh, interesting point. Interesting question. We didn't ask winemaking questions, so I think no. For me, the results we've got today that I've just presented are more for the marketing and sales side and the social media side of Ontario wines and promoting Ontario wines and to particularly to consumers. I think more in-depth work with regards to wine styles, with regards to age and all that sort of things. Those things would be more. But Gary's done, you know, Gary's work that he presented earlier with regards to willingness to pay. You know, he had monetary work. Remember that this is a small part of a big project that I've just presented today. So the work up front that Gary presented in January incorporated willingness to pay and wine styles and wine sparklings and all that sort of stuff. So when it's all finished and put together, we'll shed some more light on that. But he's got that information, a lot of that information, and some of that work's already been done. You know, Gary's been involved in that in the past as well. But yeah, post-COVID it'd be interesting to see. I mean, that's the other thing though, isn't it? You think about the financial situation of individuals now, and the frequency of wine purchasing during COVID now, a year later, many things would have likely have changed. So,
yeah, I kind of thought that too, especially when it was a younger demographic who saw the most impact. Because I'm going to say, I mean, I don't know, obviously, but would assume that demographic was probably hardest hit by the pandemic in terms of their financials and economic status and their job and that kind of thing as well.
And that table, that graph at the end from Wine Intelligence, you saw there that the arrow go down for that age group with regards to wine consumers across Canada. Yeah, it will be very different. Well, not all of it, some aspects will be different. I mean, there's still this wonderful feeling about supporting supporting Ontario, but there's no clear clarification or understanding really of what local actually means. And it's not just wine, that it happens in so many other aspects of life. It's sort of it depends how each person has their own idea of what local is. That's the difficulty. So just by defining local and bringing it down to the scale that you want it to be, then that would change that idea that local wine is from anywhere in Canada and North America, which of course is huge. Yeah.
And I guess just to conclude, when we were talking about the winemaking side, would it be fair to say though that winemakers can take some validation in the fact that they're producing a product that the consumer really enjoys, right? Because they're purchasing local because of the taste and the flavor profile, and as well as just supporting.
Absolutely, and I think these sort of this sort of data into consumer insights to what the Ontario wine drinkers, that's the market that's on the doorstep, is something that needs to be done on a regular basis. And constantly be looked into, and these sort of questions asked to keep track of what's happening. Doing it all on a Canadian basis is one thing. I mean, again, I've got this thing about Canada being huge, but doing it getting this sort of information and data on a provincial basis is so important. Yeah.
Okay, great. And I think that's all of our questions, and you've done a really great job of kind of expanding on your research for us. So thank you so much for that. And thank you again for your time and just being here today and giving this virtual lecture for us. Thank you everybody who's watching at home on their back patios, maybe enjoying that nice sunshine that's out there today. We'll be back next week again, same time, 3 p.m. on March the 10th, also a Wednesday. Our lecturer next week will be Annette Nasuth, and she's from the University of Guelph. Annette will be talking about grapeling with low temperatures. So you can kind of assume what the topic is going to be based on that little pun that she's included in her title there. So that's everything for today. Thanks again for everyone for joining us, and hope you're able to join us next week. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Sarah.
Bye.